This is an outrage! We have failed!
One of the world's most feared armies made the same dumb mistake as Napoleon. They went to war with Russia. They were told not to go, they went anyway, and then they made a series of blunders that would lead to their own destruction. This is the story of Hitler's fatal mistake in Russia. In June of 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by tanks, planes, and artillery, crossed into the Soviet Union with one mission: to destroy it before it had the chance to fight back. On paper, the plan looked unstoppable. The Wehrmacht had crushed Poland in weeks, rolled through France in just over a month, and driven the British off the continent. To many in Germany, it seemed inevitable that the Soviet Union would fall like the others. The plan was bold. Take Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union, cut off its command and supply systems, and end the war in a matter of months. The Germans were so confident that soldiers didn't even pack proper winter uniforms, because the war, they were told, would be over by Christmas. It was supposed to be a lightning strike, fast and devastating. But Hitler couldn't stick to his own plan. Instead of focusing everything on Moscow, he became obsessed with resources oil in the Caucasus, grain in Ukraine, and industrial centers spread across the Soviet Union. His army was divided into 3 massive groups: Army Group north toward Leningrad, Army Group south toward Ukraine, and Army Group center toward Moscow. What could have been one concentrated knockout punch was split into 3 different directions. This decision might sound small, but in war, focus matters. Imagine you're in a boxing match. You have a chance to land a knockout blow to the head, but instead, you keep punching at the arms and stomach. Sure, you cause damage, but you don't end the fight. That was Hitler's mistake. Instead of going for Moscow, the nerve center of the Soviet Union, he spread his punches all over the map. The Germans did make rapid progress at first. Villages and towns fell by the thousands. Soviet armies were encircled, and millions of Red Army soldiers were taken prisoner. The sheer scale of the invasion was staggering, but every mile the Germans advanced, their supply lines stretched thinner. Trucks broke down, horses struggled to keep up, and railroads had to be rebuilt because the Soviet Union used a different track gauge. The speed that had won Hitler, his earlier victories began to slow. Meanwhile, Stalin and the Soviets did not collapse. Despite huge losses, they kept raising new armies. Factories were moved east, far beyond the reach of German bombers, and kept producing tanks, planes, and rifles. Civilians worked day and night under brutal conditions to keep the war machine alive. And unlike France, which had fallen quickly, the Soviet Union had both the size and the manpower to keep fighting, no matter how many defeats it suffered. By the late summer of 1941, Army Group Center had pushed to within sight of Moscow. German officers knew that if they struck hard then, they could probably take the city. But Hitler ordered a pause. He turned his attention south, sending troops to capture Ukraine and its resources. This gave the Soviets precious time to regroup, build defenses, and prepare for the inevitable German attack on Moscow. That delay would prove disastrous. What's striking about this decision is how much it mirrors Napoleon's own invasion of Russia in 1812. Napoleon also marched in with a huge army, confident he could crush the Russians. He too spread his forces, underestimated Russian resilience, and failed to prepare for the vast distances and harsh climate. And just like Napoleon, Hitler would find himself trapped in a nightmare that no amount of early victories could escape. The soldiers on the ground began to feel the cracks long before Hitler would admit them. Supplies were running low, food was scarce, and the further east they marched, the harder the fighting became. Soviet resistance stiffened, and partisan fighters began attacking German supply lines from behind. The war that was supposed to end quickly was dragging on, and the Germans were still nowhere near total victory. Yet Hitler refused to adjust. He continued to believe his willpower alone could carry the war. He dismissed warnings from his generals, ignored logistical nightmares, and insisted on pushing forward. By the time autumn rains turned roads into oceans of mud, German tanks and trucks were stuck axle-deep in muck. Soldiers trudged through endless sludge, and every advance slowed to a crawl. The so-called blitzkrieg had turned into a grinding slog, and winter was still ahead. The one thing everyone told Hitler not to underestimate was the Russian winter. but he did. German soldiers were still wearing summer uniforms as temperatures plunged below freezing. Engines wouldn't start, weapons jammed, and men froze in their trenches. By then, the Soviets had regrouped, reinforced Moscow, and were ready to launch a counterattack. The disaster was in motion. Operation Barbarossa, which had started with the promise of a quick and decisive victory, was already showing the cracks that would destroy the German war effort in the East. What Hitler had imagined as a lightning war had turned into a drawn-out struggle against an enemy too vast and too determined to collapse. And this was just the beginning. If you want to hear how this gamble unraveled, stay tuned for the next part of the story. For now, make sure to like this video, leave a comment about what you think was Hitler's biggest blunder in Russia, and subscribe to Dumb Historian so you don't miss the rest of this series. History is full of leaders who thought they were smarter than everyone else and paid the price. In a fatal move that would change the course of the war, Hitler decided to pivot his army south, away from Moscow, and toward the fertile lands of Ukraine and the oil-rich Caucasus. This was not part of the original plan. The generals who had drawn up Operation Barbarossa wanted to strike at Moscow, because Moscow wasn't just a city, it was the brain of the Soviet Union. It was where Stalin directed the war, where communications flowed, where the rail network converged. Taking it would have been like cutting the head off a snake. But Hitler, in his arrogance, believed he knew better. He looked at a map and saw the vast farmland of Ukraine and the oil wells of the Caucasus and thought, if I seize these resources, the Soviet Union will collapse on its own. On paper, the idea made sense to him. Without grain, millions would starve. Without oil, the Soviet tanks and planes would be useless. In reality, this pivot tore the momentum right out of the German invasion. Instead of driving straight toward Moscow in the summer of 1941, when the roads were dry, and the Soviets were reeling from one defeat after another, Hitler's army veered south into a whole new campaign. Every mile they marched away from Moscow was a mile lost in the race against time, and time mattered more than anything else. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, depended on speed. It wasn't about slowly grinding the enemy down. It was about shocking them into collapse before they could regroup. But by sending his army south, Hitler turned his blitzkrieg into a crawl. Instead of one decisive strike, the Germans got bogged down in massive battles of encirclement in Ukraine. Yes, they captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, but each battle chewed up weeks of valuable time, consumed fuel, and stretched supply lines even thinner. The Battle of Kiev is a perfect example. It was one of the largest encirclements in history. Nearly 700,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped and captured. To many German generals, it looked like a stunning victory. But victories on paper don't always win wars. While they were busy fighting in Ukraine, the clock was ticking in Moscow. Soviet reinforcements were streaming in, fresh defenses were being built, and the Red Army was learning from its mistakes. Every day, the Germans spent chasing resources in the south gave the Soviets more time to prepare for the real showdown. It's almost like watching someone chase coins on the ground while ignoring the fact that a train is about to hit them. Hitler thought the resources in Ukraine and the Caucasus were the prize. In reality, Moscow was the real target that could have ended the war in one blow. By the time he realized this, it was already too late. The pivot also revealed another flaw. For him, the war in the East wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was about conquest, colonization, and plunder. He believed the German people needed living space and that Ukraine's farmland would feed his empire. This obsession blinded him to the simple military truth that you can win a war if you defeat your enemy's ability to fight. Seizing grain and oil meant nothing if the Soviet government, its army, and its factories were still standing. Meanwhile, the German soldiers on the ground were the ones paying the price for this decision. They had marched hundreds of miles, fought brutal battles, and now found themselves diverted into new campaigns that seemed endless. Supplies were running out, trucks were breaking down, and horses, which the Germans still relied on heavily for transport, were collapsing from exhaustion. Imagine being a soldier who thought the war would be over by Christmas, only to find yourself stuck in muddy fields of Ukraine, fighting endless battles with Moscow, your supposed main goals, still far out of reach. The Soviet side, for all its chaos, was starting to adapt. Stalin's leadership, brutal as it was, began to stabilize the front. Factories deep in the east continued to churn out weapons. New armies were raised, The Red Army that had been smashed in the first weeks of the invasion was no longer the same force. It was learning, hardening, and slowly regaining its confidence. By forcing the fight south, Hitler gave the Soviets the one thing they needed most: time. And while Hitler obsessed over resources, he overlooked how resources worked in war. Oil fields in the Caucasus were hundreds of miles away. Even if the Germans captured them, they didn't have the infrastructure to transport or refine the oil quickly enough to help the war effort. The farmland of Ukraine required workers, harvesters, and secure supply lines to actually feed Germany. Instead, scorched earth tactics left fields burned and railways destroyed. So, what Hitler thought would be a jackpot of supplies often turned out to be nothing but ashes. Generals like Heinz Guderian, one of the architects of Blitzkrieg, argued bitterly against the pivot. He knew Moscow was the key. He wanted to strike before the Soviets could organize. But Hitler overruled him. The German high command was fractured, divided between Hitler's fantasies and the professional soldiers who understood the practical realities of war. This split only deepened as the campaign dragged on. By the time Army Group Center was finally ordered back toward Moscow, it was September. The dry summer months were gone. The autumn rains were beginning. The roads turned into rivers of mud, slowing the German advance to a crawl. Tanks and trucks sank up to their axles. Soldiers trudged through endless sludge. The speed of the early summer had evaporated, replaced by exhaustion and frustration, and then came the cold. The infamous Russian winter was about to arrive. The German army had no winter clothing, no antifreeze for its vehicles, no preparations for temperatures that would drop far below freezing. Hitler had gambled everything on a short war, and by pivoting south, he ensured that his army would now face the long nightmare of fighting in the Russian winter. This strategic blunder was more than just a mistake on the battlefield. It revealed the deep flaws in Hitler's leadership. He was not a strategist who listened to advice, adjusted to reality, or understood logistics. He was a dictator who believed his instincts were greater than the expertise of his generals. That arrogance cost his army precious time, momentum, and ultimately their chance to win the war quickly. When the Germans finally approached Moscow in late 1941, they were exhausted, undersupplied, and facing an enemy that had recovered and fortified. What could have been a knockout blow in the summer had turned into a desperate gamble in the winter. Hitler's obsession with resources had turned his lightning war into a drawn-out disaster, and this was just the middle act of the tragedy. The fatal pivots out didn't just delay victory, it made victory impossible. What followed was a clash from Moscow that would test the limits of both armies and mark the beginning of the end for Hitler's dreams of conquering the East. The German war machine looked unstoppable in the early years of World War II. Blitzkrieg had rolled over Poland, smashed through France, and crushed everything in its path. Soldiers marched with confidence, tanks raced across borders, and the propaganda made them look like the smartest, sharpest, most advanced army in history. But then came Russia, and Russia, as always, had a trick waiting that no amount of German planning could defeat the winter. The cold did not care about tanks or planes or soldiers with iron helmets. The cold crept in quietly, wrapped itself around them, and showed just how unprepared they really were. At first, the Germans believed they would take Moscow before winter set in. The plan seemed simple: push hard, strike fast, take the capital, and the Soviet Union would collapse. Hitler himself was convinced the Red Army would crumble like all the other armies before it. But wars are not fought on paper. In reality, the Germans had already lost precious time in the south. They were delayed by unexpected resistance, by long supply lines, and by the vast distances of the Soviet landscape. By the time they pushed toward Moscow, the warm days were gone. Autumn rain turned the roads into oceans of mud, where tanks sank, trucks stalled, and soldiers trudged knee-deep in filth. They thought the mud was bad, but the mud was only the opening act. The real show came when the temperatures plunged below zero. The German army had marched into the Soviet Union in summer uniforms, light coats, thin boots, and nothing close to what they would need for a Russian winter. Why? Because their leaders thought they would win before the snow fell. They did not pack for the cold, because they did not believe they would still be fighting. It was arrogance on a scale so large, it's almost laughable. Picture thousands of men standing in snowdrifts, shivering in light jackets, trying to wrap rags around their feet because proper winter boots were never issued. Their tanks refused to start in the frozen nights. Engines locked solid with ice. Their guns jammed, oil froze, and even the mighty German war machine was reduced to a broken, rattling mess by something as simple as cold weather. Meanwhile, the Soviets, used to the climate, pulled on fur-lined coats, boots built for snow, and marched with grim determination. They were not better armed, but they were prepared. To a Russian peasant, minus 30 degrees Celsius was brutal but survivable. To a German soldier from Berlin or Munich, who had never seen such temperatures, it was death itself. Men froze where they stood, rifles still slung over their shoulders. Others suffered frostbite so severe that hands and feet had to be amputated. The German army that had terrified Europe now looked like a clumsy giant, stumbling, shivering, and cracking apart from the inside. It is almost comical to think of it. These were men who thought they could outthink everyone, who called themselves the most disciplined army in the world. They planned down to the last bullet, the last gallon of fuel, the last loaf of bread, but they forgot to plan for winter in Russia. History students often joke that the Russian winter is the greatest general in history, undefeated across centuries. Napoleon tried before, and his army froze and starved on the same icy ground. 130 years later, Hitler thought he could do better. The result was the same. Russia didn't even need to win every battle. The winter itself fought on their side. Imagine being one of those German soldiers. You left home in summer, cheered by crowds, convinced you would be in Moscow by Christmas. Now it is December, and instead of parades, you sit in a frozen trench, teeth chattering, wrapped in blankets, stolen from peasants' houses, trying to keep your fingers from turning black. Your rifle will not fire because the grease has turned solid. The tank beside you won't move because the fuel is frozen. You are hungry because supply lines stretch hundreds of miles across hostile land and food cannot get through. You look at your comrades, their faces pale and hollow, and realize the war is not being lost to bullets, but to the cold. Some stories from that winter sound almost absurd. Soldiers tried lighting fires under tank engines to thaw them out, only to set the machines on fire. Men urinated on their rifles in desperate attempts to keep the metal warm enough to fire a shot. Others broke apart furniture from captured villages just to burn something for heat. The proud army that had taken Paris in weeks now looked like a group of lost travelers, stumbling through snow, freezing to death in a land they thought they could conquer. The Soviets took full advantage. They launched counterattacks while the Germans struggled. Soviet soldiers, better dressed and better adapted to the climate, pushed the invaders back from Moscow. The Germans had expected an easy victory, but instead they found themselves retreating, bleeding, and freezing. The winter turned their confidence into humiliation. What was once a mighty advance became a desperate struggle for survival. And yet, Hitler still demanded that his soldiers hold their positions no matter the cost. Retreat was forbidden. So men died, not in glorious battle, but frozen stiff in the snow, bodies buried by blizzards. The arrogance of their leaders doomed them. They believed they could bend Russia to their will, but Russia, with its endless space and merciless winters, bent them instead. If you think about it, this is the funniest tragedy of all. A massive army, armed with the best weapons, backed by a ruthless dictator. Undone not by clever strategies of their enemies, but by something as simple as the weather. They marched into Russia thinking themselves geniuses of war, but they forgot to bring coats. In the end, the unrelenting Russian winter proved to be the smartest, cruelest, and most loyal defender of the Soviet Union. What makes it even more ironic is that this mistake was not new. History had already written the lesson when Napoleon tried the same invasion, and yet Hitler believed he was smarter. He thought his war machine was invincible. He thought his soldiers could outlast the cold. But when the blizzards came, the truth was revealed. Even the most brutal and intelligent-seeming leaders can be foolish, and their armies can crumble not from battle, but from their own arrogance. So when people speak of great battles and powerful armies, it is worth remembering this. Sometimes, the greatest enemy is not another general or another army, but nature itself. The German army looked unstoppable, yet they froze in their tracks, victims of their own overconfidence. They marched in with pride, but winter stripped that pride away, leaving only cold, hunger, and death. And in that silence of snow and frost, the myth of their invincibility was shattered. The Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse in the summer of 1941. Cities were falling. Millions of soldiers had been captured, and the German army seemed unstoppable. Yet, Hitler's decision to divert his forces south gave the Soviets something priceless: time to breathe, time to regroup, and time to transform their desperate defense into a total war effort. This mistake shifted the balance of the campaign and gave the Soviets a chance to do something they had mastered throughout history: absorb. The blow: retreat deep into their vast lands and let their enemy bleed out on the long march east. The Soviet strategy wasn't glamorous. It wasn't about flashy victories or decisive battles at first. Instead, it was about resilience, about retreating when necessary and trading land for survival. The Red Army fell back, burning crops, factories, and homes as they went. Entire regions were stripped bare. Bridges were blown up, railways torn apart, and anything useful to the Germans destroyed. This scorched earth policy wasn't just brutal, it was effective. The further the Germans advanced, the less they had to live on. Supplies had to be dragged hundreds of miles across roads that were little more than dirt tracks, turning every advance into a logistical nightmare. And while the Germans stretched themselves thinner and thinner, the Soviets were building up their strength. Stalin's government ordered entire factories to be dismantled piece by piece, loaded onto trains, and shipped east of the Ural Mountains, far beyond the reach of the German advance. These factories didn't just vanish, they were rebuilt in record time. Workers, many of them women and children, labored day and night to produce tanks, planes, rifles, and artillery. By the end of 1941, Soviet industry, thought to be on the verge of collapse, was instead roaring back to life. It wasn't just machines that the Soviets mobilized. The entire population was thrown into the struggle. Farmers worked in freezing conditions to keep food supplies flowing. Civilians dug trenches, built fortifications, and supplied the front with whatever they could carry. Propaganda hammered home the message that this was not just a war between armies, but a fight for survival itself. Every Soviet citizen was told that their very existence depended on resistance, no matter the cost. The Red Army itself, though battered and bloodied, began to adapt. In the early days of Barbarossa, German blitzkrieg tactics had torn them apart. But by autumn, the Soviets were learning how to counter these maneuvers. Instead of fighting head-on in open battles they could not win, they pulled back, drew the Germans deeper, and hit them in unexpected ways. Soviet partisans mauled groups of fighters behind enemy lines, sabotaged German supply depots, ambushed convoys, and disrupted railways. These attacks didn't win battles outright, but they made the German advance slower, weaker, and more painful. As the Germans pushed further east, their problems grew. Their supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, but the further they went, the worse the terrain became. Trucks broke down, horses died, and fuel was constantly in short supply. Soldiers went hungry, slept in the open, and lacked winter clothing. For every step forward, they seemed to lose their ability to fight at full strength. Meanwhile, Soviet reinforcements were arriving constantly. Whole divisions were raised and trained in the interior, then sent to the front to fill the gaps. The sheer size of the Soviet Union became its greatest weapon. The Germans had thought they could finish the war in months. Instead, they found themselves caught in a campaign that demanded endurance, something the Soviets had in spades. Cities like Smolensk, Leningrad, and later Moscow became symbols of resistance. Even when surrounded, Soviet soldiers fought on, delaying the Germans just long enough for new defenses to form further east. The resilience of the Soviet defense wasn't only about strategy, it was also about willpower. Stalin, despite his paranoia and brutality, refused to abandon Moscow. When German troops came within sight of the city, there were even discussions among his generals about evacuating the capital. Stalin's answer was blunt: he stayed. His decision gave Soviet citizens a sense of determination. If the leader himself was not leaving, then there was no excuse for anyone else to give up. This kind of resolve had a powerful psychological impact, both on Soviet troops and the civilian population. Winter, too, became an ally of the Soviets. When the snow fell and temperatures plunged, it exposed the weakness of the German army's preparation. The Wehrmacht had marched into Russia with summer uniforms, expecting to be finished before the cold set in. Instead, they found themselves shivering in trenches, weapons freezing, fuel turning to sludge, and men suffering frostbite by the thousands. Soviet soldiers, better equipped for the cold and more accustomed to hardship, used the weather to their advantage. They launched counterattacks when the Germans were at their weakest, using skis, sleds, and winter camouflage to strike swiftly and vanish into the snow. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the Soviet defense was its adaptability. The early months of Barbarossa had been a disaster, but by late 1941, the Red Army was no longer the same force that had crumbled in June. It was harder, more disciplined, and learning the art of modern war. Commanders like Zhukov emerged, men who could organize massive defenses and then launch brutal counterstrikes. The Red Army still suffered terrible losses, but with each month that passed, it grew stronger, not weaker. For the Germans, this was the nightmare scenario. Hitler had promised his people a quick and glorious victory, but instead, they were locked in a war of attrition against an enemy that refused to die. The more the Germans advanced, the more they became trapped by the very land they were trying to conquer. Every ruined village, every frozen forest, every destroyed railway was part of the Soviet defense. It was not one battle that broke the Germans, but a relentless, grinding resistance that wore them down bit by bit. By the time the Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow, they were a shadow of the force that had stormed across the Soviet border in June. The Soviets, once reeling and desperate, had rebuilt their strength. Fresh troops from Siberia, hardened by brutal winters and fierce training, arrived to defend the capital. They were well-equipped, rested, and ready to fight. Their presence turned the tide at the most critical moment. The German soldiers, meanwhile, found themselves facing not just an army, but an entire nation that had mobilized to resist them. The Soviets had turned retreat into resilience, loss into endurance, and desperation into determination. Hitler's blunder had given them the time they needed, and they used it with ruthless efficiency. This was the essence of the Soviet defense. It was not about avoiding defeat, it was about surviving long enough to make defeat impossible. The Germans had been promised an easy war, but what they got was a quagmire. The Soviet Union, bloodied but unbroken, had stood its ground, and the longer it stood, the more the tide of the war began to shift. The German invasion of the Soviet Union was supposed to be swift and decisive. In Hitler's mind, it was to be another blitzkrieg campaign, where tanks, planes, and infantry smashed through the enemy, broke their will to resist, and forced surrender within months. For the first weeks, that vision seemed to be reality. Millions of Soviet troops were captured, entire armies dissolved, and cities fell in quick succession. Berlin celebrated as if victory was inevitable, but beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. The moment Hitler chose to divide his forces, those cracks widened into a fatal weakness. Instead of driving all his strength toward Moscow, the heart of Soviet power, he pulled key units away to seize Ukraine and its resources. On paper, this looked like a clever move. Ukraine was rich in grain, coal, and industry. Capturing it would weaken the Soviets and strengthen Germany. Yet in practice, this division of forces slowed the advance, diluted the impact of the German offensive, and gave the Soviets something they desperately needed. Time. That time was priceless. The Soviets used it to dig deeper defensive lines, rebuild their armies, and shift their industries eastward. Every week the Germans spent chasing new objectives was another week the Red Army grew stronger. Hitler's gamble had transformed a campaign of speed into a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, Germany was doomed. The early months of Barbarossa had relied on momentum. German units raced across hundreds of miles, fueled by shock, fear, and the chaos of sudden strikes. But momentum is fragile. It needs constant pressure, and once it slows, it becomes nearly impossible to recover. By the autumn of 1941, the German drive had lost its sharp edge. Tanks broke down after endless miles of dust and mud. Horses, still the backbone of German logistics, collapsed from exhaustion. Ammunition and fuel lagged far behind the front lines. Soldiers fought in the same uniforms they had marched in months earlier, already ragged and worn. Meanwhile, the Soviets absorbed blow after blow and kept fighting. The scorched earth policy left the Germans advancing into wastelands, unable to live off the land as Napoleon's armies once had tried and failed to do. What little food or shelter existed had been torched or carried away. Every mile eastward stretched the German supply lines thinner, until basic necessities like bread and boots became scarce. The decision to split the German army was more than just a mistake in strategy, it was a failure of vision. Hitler underestimated the scale of the Soviet Union, the depth of its resources, and the resilience of its people. He believed he could crush a nation of millions with a single summer campaign. Yet by diverting his strength, he created a war that demanded years of fighting. The Wehrmacht was designed for short wars, not endless grinding battles across thousands of miles of hostile territory. By December 1941, the Germans had reached the outskirts of Moscow. They could see the spires of the city through binoculars. Soldiers wrote letters home saying they believed victory was only days away. But the reality was the opposite. Exhaustion had set in, supplies had run dry, morale was sinking. And the Soviet counteroffensive, led by fresh Siberian troops trained for winter war, smashed into the German lines. What had begun as an unstoppable advance turned into a desperate struggle for survival in the snow. The German army, once the pride of Europe, found itself digging trenches in frozen ground, huddling in thin coats, and fighting not only Soviet soldiers, but the brutal Russian winter. Frostbite crippled as many men as bullets. Tanks refused to start in the cold. Horses died in droves. German soldiers wrapped newspapers around their legs for warmth. The myth of invincibility that had carried the Wehrmacht across Europe collapsed under the weight of ice, hunger, and unrelenting Soviet counterattacks. This was not the quick, glorious war Hitler had promised. It was a self-inflicted defeat. The division of forces had ensured that Germany could not strike a decisive blow when it mattered most. Instead of delivering a knockout punch, they had thrown a series of glancing blows that failed to finish the enemy. The Soviets, bloodied but unbroken, stood taller with each passing month. As the war dragged on, the consequences of that early mistake only grew. Germany found itself locked in a conflict that consumed men, machines, and resources at a pace it could not sustain. Every new offensive bled the army further, and every loss was harder to replace. The war in the East became a giant meat grinder, swallowing divisions whole. By 1943, with defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, the illusion of German dominance was gone. But the seeds of that downfall had been planted back in 1941, when Hitler chose ambition over strategy and divided his army at the very moment unity mattered most. It's easy to look back and imagine what might have been had the Germans focused everything on Moscow. Could they have captured the Soviet capital before winter? Could the loss of Moscow have forced Stalin to sue for peace? The truth is uncertain. But what is clear is that the actual decision to divide their strength guaranteed failure. Instead of concentrating power, they diluted it. Instead of overwhelming the Soviets, they gave them time to recover. Instead of victory, they laid the foundation for their own defeat. What followed was a war unlike anything the Germans had ever faced. The Eastern Front devoured millions of lives. Entire cities became battlefields, where fighting lasted not for days, but for months. Civilians starved, soldiers froze, and whole regions were reduced to ashes. The war that Hitler had started to expand his empire instead consumed it piece by piece. For the Soviets, the early disaster of 1941 became a story of endurance. They had been pushed to the edge of collapse, yet through resilience and sacrifice, they clawed their way back. For the Germans, the summer of 1941 marked the high point of their power. Every step afterward was a slow retreat, a war of survival they could not win. In the end, the invasion of the Soviet Union was not just a gamble, it was a gamble lost by Germany itself. Hitler's decision to split his forces turned potential victory into certain defeat. What might have been the destruction of the Soviet Union became instead the destruction of the Third Reich. And that is where the story of this blunder leaves us. A single decision, made in the heat of ambition, set the course for the most brutal front in human history. The Germans, who once seemed unstoppable, had trapped themselves in a war they could never win. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of the greatest strategic mistakes in history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. There are always more stories to uncover, more blunders to explore, and more lessons to learn from the past that was anything but simple.